Chris Carter, 2003.
From what I understand, the box set is primarily the result of you making it happen. Is that correct?
It is, yeah. About 2 years ago, we did a Chris and Cozy performance in London, and Daniel Miller turned up, and we had this idea, Cozy and I, that because the anniversary of TG was coming out, the 25th anniversary, that they should represent the original cassette box set in CD format, because it was getting bootlegged everywhere. You know, there's so many bootlegs around of it, and we get all the flack for that, of course, even though we're not doing it. So we suggested to Mute that they, release it as a CD box set. But at the time, they just didn't have the finances. They just couldn't do it because it's such a mammoth task. The production costs were just astronomical. And he said, well, I'll just have to take a rain check on it, and we'll give us a little while, maybe we can do it. And then with the EMI thing, the buyout last year, there was a lot of cash flow going through Mute, and they said, okay, let's do it. We've got the money. Let's put it together. And then it was like, oh my God, we've actually got to do it now, all this work. So we sort of slightly missed the 25th anniversary by about a year, but we did it as quick as we could. And we put it together. Well, I mean, it was mainly Cozy and I and Sleazy that put it together, but and I did all the mastering and all the audio side of it. I sort of underestimated how much work there was, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about, in the remastering notes for the set, you do talk about that. Editing was kept to a minimum and that you really didn't do a lot of processing. What did you do to clean up the tapes then?
To start with, because a lot of the gigs were recorded on 2 or 3 different machines, so the first thing we had to do was go through all the tapes and get as many of the original tapes as we could from each of our collections, because we each had different versions of certain gigs, So we had to collect them all together and then listen to the tapes and see which sounded, not just technically, but which sounded good and represented that gig well. And then we had to decide first on which actual tapes we were going to use. And then once we decided, we transferred the tapes on a Sony cassette deck straight into a Mac. And I used a program called Spark, which is just a stereo mastering program. We put them into that, topped and tailed them, and we initially made this decision that all the tapes, no matter how long they were, would be 60 minutes on CD, which is how the original cassettes were produced. They were done on C60s. So we thought we'd try and follow that through, and we'd make all the CDs exactly 60 minutes long, regardless of whether the gig was 60 minutes. So if the gig ran over, it got edited off at the end. And if the gig was short, then there's tape piss or, for the remainder of the 60 minutes. So,
or audiences yammering for a little while.
Yeah, or audience noise, people talking, anything like that. So we transferred them into our Mac, edited them. We put slight amount of denoising on. We had this denoising program that had this very good denoising algorithm that analyzes the tape noise only and then tries to take some of that out of the sound. But we found that if we put too much denoising on, it made the sound slightly artificial. So we ended up leaving most of the tape noise on and just keeping the restoration to a minimum. What you hear is basically what was on the cassette.
Well, the sound quality is quite amazing, really.
It is, yeah. Well, we used pretty good machines at the time. We had, we spent quite a lot of money on cassette machines in the 70s. Mm-hmm. We had about 3 different machines, stereo machines. Sleazy had one, I had one, and we had like an industrial one. And so we used multiple machines as like backups in case one didn't work, because we tried to record every single performance. And we was a bit paranoid about missing a performance. And initially it was done just so we could analyse the performance afterwards. We'd go back to the studio after a gig or the next day and listen to what we'd done and, see what we liked. And we'd put rough sort of compilations together for ourselves and friends and people like that.
Well, Peter,
so we did have some good source material, which did help the mastering quite a lot.
Chris Carter, 2003.
Peter said something about that, about, the performances, and he said that's, the case for him even today. He's not very aware of what he's doing during the performance. He talked about the trance aspect of it. in a very active, deep trance and really, not knowing. So I'm sure that listening back to those tapes after the performances, I don't know if that's the case for you, but it could be very revealing.
It is, especially 25 years later. I mean, about half of the tapes, I don't even remember doing what I did on the tapes. Mm-hmm. I'd listen to the gigs and I'd have the information in front of me, where it was recorded, the year, everything, and I just could not remember any of it. And because I was, I'd just go off in one of my trances or whatever while we were playing, and you just do what you do, and then at the end of it, you hardly remembered anything. And it's only until you listen to the tape that you realise you actually did what you did, and you think, God, I really did that. That's amazing. And I know Sleazy, he's mentioned that as well. And it's true, but that's why it's good to have some evidence of what you've done sometimes, because you do, you sort of go into some sort of transcendental sort of state, I suppose.
Chris, 2003.
So, the music was all very improvised, and I think one of the things that came up while we were talking to him too was the idea that, to some extent, performing in the clubs live with sound systems that had the capability to reproduce frequencies and sound levels would probably be, really, it's the first time you step on stage and you're actually hearing some of the music that you're making, perhaps in a way you intended it to be heard. But I was kind of wondering how much of the material that's released on the official record releases, the studio releases, how much of that is culled directly from live performance tapes? How much of that was, or was any of that, how much of that is created in the studio? I know some of it was.
It's funny, the studio stuff, it's very different from the live stuff, and they're like different entities in themselves. There's the live TG, and there are people that like live TG, and only live TG. And then there's the studio-based TG sound, and there are some people that just like that. It's like two TGs, in fact. And the studio stuff is very different because it was more structured, we'd spend more time over it, and there was less improvising. Whereas the live stuff was like 90% of it was improvised. I don't know if it was intentional, but that's how it worked out, and that's how it stayed almost the whole time, other than when we did an album that included a live track or something like that, or like Heathen Earth, where it was a live performance in the studio. It wasn't really a conscious thing to do it, but we did have two separate sounds, and they are quite different, and that's just how it turned out.
Chris Carter, 2003.
When I was talking to Cozy, I was asking her about, and I'd like to ask you the same thing, what you were doing prior to getting involved with TG, and maybe even if you'd talk a little bit about growing up, your childhood, how you became involved with Genesis and Cozy and Sleazy.
Again, we were all from fairly middle-class backgrounds, I think. I was from a typical sort of middle-class background, sort of living in suburbs. My dad had a shop. My mother was working for a cosmetics company. I had a sister. But the main difference is my dad was really into tape recorders and recordings and stuff like that, and he had a few tape recorders that could do sound on sound and tricks, and he used to show me stuff to do on that, and then he bought me a little tape recorder of my own when I was about 12 or so, and I used to do these little experiments, recording stuff off the radio and all sort of mad stuff. None of it really worked too well, and then he bought me an inventor's kit where you could put components together and make radios and oscillators and stuff like this, all very basic. But that was planted the seed for what I later became. And he had friends that were into sound and stuff like this, and he was always playing music, and there was a lot of that going on in the house at the time. And then while I was at school, a friend of mine, I got friendly with this guy that was into doing light shows and DJing and stuff like that. And so I started on this other tangent that was involved with visuals and projections, and we used to go out and do projections and light shows for bands. So there's all this sort of crossing over of different sort of live stuff that I was doing. And then I got involved with the Lacey family and this guy called John Lacey. And we started actually going out and doing performances where he'd do a light show for me, and I'd actually play stuff on stage from homemade circuits that I'd built and synthesizers. It was all quite sort of avant-garde and a bit arty as well, I suppose. But we used to go around universities, colleges, places like that on sort of college circuits, and just I had this show called Waveforms, and I'd just be on stage doodling around on my synths. My friend John and my friend Chris would be projecting stuff and behind me. And then at one of these shows that we did, in fact one of the last shows that we were sort of winding it down, unsure of what we were going to do next, and Genesis and Cozy turned up at the last gig we were doing and introduced themselves. And that must have been 74 or 75.
So they actually came and recruited you?
Yeah, they did. Yeah, you came and recruited me.
They saw you with all the electronic gear and said, "We need him."
Yeah, it was a bit like that. And because they knew that this was the last gig I was doing, and I wasn't sure what I was going to be doing next. So they said, "Well, why don't you come to our space that we've got in East London, this studio they had." So I went down and we started jamming and trying things out and got talking. We had a lot of things in common, a lot of shared interests. And that was the beginning of it. And they were sort of at the tail end of Coombe at that point. And I wasn't. And John, who was doing the lights for me, was also in Coombe. He was involved with Coombe quite heavily. But I didn't really want to go into that because what I was doing was sort of verging on this sort of arty thing. And I wanted to go more just into straight sort of music. And that was like the beginnings of Throbbing Gristle, where it sort of mutated from Coombe into Throbbing Gristle.
So that would be, your reluctance to join Coombe was just seeing it as a kind of a limited forum?
It was, yeah. It wasn't really what I was into doing. I'm not sure what it was. It didn't appeal to me at the time. Maybe another time in my life it might have done, but it didn't then. And then we started doodling in the studio. And initially Sleazy wasn't involved.
Chris, 2003.
You were the man with the electronics and that knowledge. Yeah. Did you? A lot of the equipment that you were using is really things that you built.
Initially, it was, yeah. Some friends that I worked with when I was doing my own Waveforms shows. They were all very hands-on, very boffin-like, nerdy types, I suppose. We all were. It's like a little group of us. And we all knew each other, and we knew Jen and Cozy, and so when TG started, we were still involved with a lot of these people. So we had friends that could build speaker cabinets and friends that could build amplifiers, and I was into building synths and noise-making circuits and stuff like that. So we had this like little industry going of like making all our own stuff because we couldn't afford to go out and buy all this gear sort of in music stores. We just didn't have the cash or the finances then. Mm-hmm. So it was a necessity that we had to build it all ourselves initially. And almost everything we had except the actual instruments, except the guitars and stuff like that, were handmade. Although we even made a guitar for Cozy at one point. But yeah, I was doing mainly the electronics then.
Well, how complex were the things you were building? Were they fairly simple, or did you...
No, they were pretty complex.
Right.
And I was self-taught as well, which I look back at some of the stuff now, especially the gristleizers. They are...
The gristleizers?
Yeah, have you heard about the gristleizers? It's like this black box. I mean, we made a bit of a mystery of it at the time. Like a black box that we all had that I'd built, and it had in it a voltage-controlled amp, a voltage-controlled filter, an oscillator, and a bunch of other stuff. And you could... Cozy's had a foot switch on it as well, and Jen's had a little oscillator in it, and Sleazy had one. And we just used to mangle our sounds through these black boxes. And I came up with this term, gristleizer. And then we started building a few more, built a few for different friends. And it sort of became quite sort of notorious, People didn't know what this gristleizer was. Because it just looked like this black box with a few knobs on the front. But it could make this wonderful racket. Everyone wanted to get their hands on one. We made one for Monty Gazaza, and I made one for a couple for Robert Rental and Thomas Lear. So there are a few others floating around, but even now people are trying to get hold of the circuit diagrams to make. In fact, someone wants to make a software version at the moment. But I did publish the design at one point. It was a great little unit, actually. We've still got ours. They still work, funnily enough.
But to look back on them now, that's a fairly basic device, is what you're saying.
Yeah, it was just like a circuit board with a bunch of transistors and resistors and, the usual stuff. It was, you could do it a lot easier nowadays, but then it was quite high tech, I suppose, in those days.
Are you still building equipment?
No, I gave up years ago. Like I say, in those days, it was a necessity because there was stuff like the GRISTLE. You couldn't actually buy anything like that at the time, unless like you bought like a Moog synthesizer and used some of the modules from that, or a Roland sort of modular system. But it was something that I had this idea of a sound in my head, and you couldn't buy it off the shelf, so I went and built it. And then later on, when you could actually go and buy stuff like that, I did started buying it from stores. And at the end of TG, a lot of the stuff we had was just stuff that we'd bought in stores. But then, having said that, we'd buy stuff and we would modify almost everything we had slightly just to make it do something else that it wasn't meant to. We still do that, in fact, sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, that makes me think of the idea that building your own devices and doing what you do with them. I mean, as opposed to things that are taken off the shelf, it's almost a homogenizer to an extent, where you listen to a lot of music today and it's like, okay, that's a whatchamacallit, and that's
you
a
can tell straight away. I still do. I mean, we all do that to a degree. I mean, you sit there listening to like a new CD or a new album, and you're analysing it all the time, even subconsciously, and you're thinking, I know where that sounds from, I know where that sample's from, you can tell. But I love the idea of circuit bending and all that whole thing as well. But it's like when you buy a synth with like hundreds of presets in it, people just always go and use the presets and all the sounds in there. But I try and sort of come up with new sounds whenever I can. I can't stand presets.
Right. So, I mean, a lot of what you're doing now is probably that kind of thing, tweaking.
Yeah. I love sound design, where you take a sound and you make something new from it, even samples. And I don't like using things dead straight. We're all still like that. Fleas is still like that. We like to come up with new and unique sounds. Yeah,
well, I think you do so successfully. Wondering what, as far as the sound that TG developed and had, what, if you kind of recall what what you thought about it at the time, or what how does it compare to maybe what your intentions might have been? The product and the intention, are they fairly similar, or what was involved in that process?
I don't know really. I have trouble remembering what was going through my mind in the 70s. I really don't know if it was the drugs or what. But I don't remember intentionally thinking, right, I've got to come up with this sound to sort of scare people, or it's funny. I mean, we used to do a lot of sound experiments with oscillators and things, and we used to try and we had this thing where we wanted to experiment with subsonics. We experimented with subsonics for months on end. And we experimented on ourselves initially, which was quite funny. We had these enormous bass bins built, and we got hold of an industrial oscillator that went subsonic, and we blew loads of speakers trying these ideas out. But it was incredible, and we did that because we thought if we try it on ourselves first and see what the audience are going to get from this, then we'll actually try it for real in a live environment. So that was like thought out, and it was intentional. And other than that, we didn't really have like a game plan where we wanted to sort of come up with tunes or concepts or things. We just, because it was improvised as well, we just go out and do what we did. Whatever came out, because that's what happened that night. A lot of it depended on what the audience was like, what the situation was like, what the venue was like, what was happening around us in our personal lives. There wasn't much planning that went on, actually.
Chris Carter, 2003. Your well-known fandom or interest in ABBA and that kind of music, and then the kind of music that Throbbing Gristle is mostly known for.
Could be more different, could they?
Right. Just kind of trying to understand, where you make a leap like that.
It's almost like therapy, Throbbing Gristle was. Because we'd listen to that stuff in the daytime. I mean, Sleazy would be listening to John Barry, and I'd be listening to ABBA. Cozy would be listening to sort of disco at work where she's dancing, and then we'd go and do a gig, and it was like, it couldn't be more different. It really couldn't. It was like getting rid of our demons or something.
So it really is, and I suppose, a way to release, pent up.
It was. I mean, it's the same now. I mean, when people say, "What do you listen to?" But we've been in the studio a lot this weekend, and when you're in the studio doing music a lot, the last thing you want to do when you come out of the studio is listen to music. You want to go and watch TV or go for a walk or do something completely different that doesn't involve your ears so much, or structure and time signatures and stuff like that. And it's a bit like that when we did TG. We'd do this stuff that just didn't come from anywhere. It was just like totally new stuff that we weren't even. It wasn't influenced by anything. So you couldn't say it was influenced by ABBA or disco or anything else that was going on at the time. It just came out of us. It was TG.
So, I mean, it wasn't influenced by anything, and there really wasn't sort of a manifesto approach to it either, I guess.
No. I mean, I know it's a cliche, but it was that industrial thing. We lived in an industrial part of London, and there was that whole industrial thing going on around us, and the noise of traffic and machines and all that. That is the only influence we really had would be, you could say, our environment, I suppose.
You all really more or less, at the time at least, if not, and perhaps still, considered yourselves non-musicians.
I still do. Yeah, I hardly ever put musician down when people ask me what my occupation is. I usually put technician or audio-visual artist or something, because I still don't class myself as a musician. I really don't. I don't think any of us do.
Do you think that the environment that you were working in culturally, politically, back in the 70s, back when TG was a thing and was, being occasionally, attacked or pointed at as evil, bad people, has that environment changed at all between now and then? Has there been any progress, do you think, or is it more of the same? Someone with a sort of a message that's a transgressive message to present, is it easier or harder to do it today?
I think in some ways it was harder then because there was nothing else. It was so new. I mean, the only other thing that was going on in parallel to what we were doing was punk, which was, and rock and, I mean, you had like, disco was really big then, and you had punk coming through, and there was rock and roll, that's what punk was really. It was just another version of rock and roll. And then along came industrial, and people just didn't know what to make of it, and we had so much trouble, especially from punk fans. I mean, they were the worst. They hated us. They really did. We had so much trouble from it. But now, I think in some ways nowadays, people are more open because there's such a diversity of stuff around. There really is. And in some ways, I think it is. In some ways, it's easier for people because they don't stand out so much now. We really stood out like a sore thumb then. There was just nothing else like us at all. Whereas now, there's so many different genres of music, and industrial music and dark and gothic and dark wave and all that stuff. It is easier for people to do stuff now. But then because there is so much stuff and so many different genres, it's harder for people to get heard. You've got to be exceptional or come up with something totally unique for people to listen to you, because they, you just think, oh, there's another industrial band, just another one of many that are going on at the time, are going on now. Whereas then, there was like a couple of little movements. There was the Sheffield movement, Cabaret Voltaire, and people like that. And there was us. There was Test Department people. There wasn't that many around, and we had our own little niches. And we all did quite well, and we came through it. But now I'd hate to be doing what we did then now, because I think it'd be really hard to be heard by people, because this stuff doesn't get played on the radio. Oh, okay, there's the internet, but there's a million other people doing stuff on the internet as well. And if people don't know you're there, then you don't stand a chance. So in some ways it's easier, because you can do it now. Anyone can do it in their bedroom. The technology's there, which makes it easier to do. But to actually get yourself heard, I think, is harder.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much material out there. I mean, it's a complete information overload.
It is, yeah.
The new war, the total war, is an information war concept. Yeah. I guess there are different ways to win that war. One is to own or control all of the outlets, and the other is to make certain kinds of outlets, I guess, so available that there's just a drowning, perhaps.
Yeah, we're drowning in a sea of information, we really are.
Chris Carter, 2003.
Running the label, was the label part of the original plan, or is that something that kind of developed?
Again, that came out of necessity, because then there wasn't the independent circuit that there is now. When we started, Rough Trade was just starting at the same time. There wasn't the finances. We were approached by Virgin, but when they actually got to hear the stuff and got to meet us and found out that we weren't pop stars and we weren't, we weren't fantastic looking and we weren't glam rock or punk, they didn't want to know. So we cobbled together some equipment, got some money together, and went to a pressing plant and just did it ourselves. And that was Secondary Report, and that's how it started. And that first release, if that hadn't have sold out, we couldn't have gone on to repress it. We gambled everything on that one release. But in a way, we weren't bothered anyway. We just thought we'd do it for ourselves and our friends, and we'd sort of give them to people and sell a few to a few shops. But it just snowballed. It just took off, and it just kept selling and selling. We had to keep repressing, which was good for us because the money came in and meant we could invest that in TG. And then from TG and doing that first release, Industrial was born, and the whole thing really took off.
Yeah, well, I mean, you did release some other material by other artists. How did that how did that happen? How did you decide what you might want to release? Because
once the Secondary Report started selling, we thought, right, we can actually, this is good. We can release our own stuff. Let's help some other people, some friends of ours, and interesting stuff that we come across. Because there really wasn't, like I said, an independent label circuit then, or anything like it, except for Rough Trade. There was, you had things like Stiff Records, but that was very sort of, there were labels like that, but they were quite mainstream really and pop-oriented. But there was nothing along the lines of Industrial at all. People were sending us stuff all the time once they heard that we were putting out our own records. So we had quite a lot to choose from. And some of the stuff we heard, we thought, right, this is really good. Let's put it out. That's how it started.
Was there much of a cassette? Was there a lot of much of a cassette movement at that time? It was very, very big, yeah. Mm-hmm. But our first releases they weren't really releases, but our first sort of compilations and things we put together were just on cassette that we used to give away and send out to people. And they were a good promo device as well, because everyone had a cassette player then. That's why we did the box set. Even after we started pressing albums, the idea of the box set came around. And that was only possible because of cassettes. We couldn't have done that as singles or albums. It just wouldn't have been feasible then, apart from the fact that it would have been an enormous box, and it would cost a fortune. Mm-hmm. But with cassettes, we actually went out and bought a couple of duplicating machines, and then we had our own little pressing, cassette duplication facility downstairs under the kitchen. Yeah, and it was the Walkman era as well, as Cozy just pointed out. A lot of people had Walkmans, and which helped the whole cassette movement, I think. Really? Yeah. I didn't realize the Walkman was that old, but yeah.
Yeah. Sleazy, when Peter went over to New York with the Hypnosis, I think it was in 76 or 77, and came back with this little machine called a Sony Stowaway, which was the precursor of the Sony Walkman. And it was like a blue mini cassette machine. And he bought a few of them, and then we wired them up so that he could use them on stage, and he had cassette loops inside them. So he had these sort of weird noises looping, and they could bring them up through the PA, and that was the first a version of a sampler, really, I suppose. We went out, we developed that whole idea following that, and we bought like loads of these Sony Stowaways, and I built a keyboard, and we had their outputs going through this little keyboard, and he could play them like a mellotron, so he could play the outputs, and he just had things looping on them all the time. That was like 77, I think, 78.
I guess that's right. I mean, CDs really, I suppose, they date back to early 80s now as well.
Yeah, that was just as we were finishing CDs, I think. We come across them much. So.
No, but I guess they really did. They were, hot on the heels of that, so to speak. Yeah. Well, so Peter used, he had a lot of just cassette machines that would play loops, and
he had loads, yeah.
Used a keyboard that you created that would just be, I guess, sort of like a valve then.
Yeah, I made him like a sequencer. It was like a 1 octave of a keyboard that was connected to these digital switches. They were just little ICs that could switch the sound on and off. And I had a little step sequencer, and he could either play and he had the outputs of the cassettes going through this keyboard and sequencer, and he could either play them by hand, or he could switch the sequencer on. They would step through, and that sequencer was synced up to a drum machine that I had. So it was quite sort of sophisticated for the time. But sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. It was a bit like that.
Was it difficult to travel with your performances, or was it fairly simple?
It was quite hard to travel. And we also had a problem because a lot of the gear was homemade and modified. And when we got to a gig, sometimes just travelling to the gig would shake things up a lot and they wouldn't work and things. So we had this policy throughout almost the whole of TG that no matter who was playing at the performance, we would always go on first, because once we set the gear up, we couldn't start moving it around for the other bands to come on, because it wouldn't work by the time we came on. It was often used to happen because it was so delicate. But once we were playing, we didn't care what happened. We just make the noise and that was it. So we were always on first, which confused a lot of people because they think Throbbing and Gristle are playing tonight, they're headlining, and they'd get there late, and it's too late, they played first,
Oh, right.
Because we had to, because we just couldn't trust the gear to work if we left it on stage and other bands were on there. So.
Yeah, I guess, you could always fall back on turning the gristleizer up a little bit when something fails.
Yeah. Yeah, the gristleizer's always worked.
Thank God for the gristleizer.
Yeah.
Chris, 2003.
Do you have any sense of how, what kind of an influence Throbbing Gristle has had? Do you hear references to it in things that you hear now and then? Do you?
Yeah, we do all the time. More so in the last year or two. The profile seems to have come up again. I mean, it's like peaks and troughs throughout the years. I mean, Mute are very good. They send us lots of press cuttings of things that we get mentioned in. But, I mean, a month doesn't go by now where we don't get a mention somewhere, or quite a few mentions. And it still amazes me, really, because it's all so long ago and far away. It still surprises me that it's so influential. But it is. I can't deny it. But I'm pleased as well.
Good.